The warehouse on West 145th Street occupied a narrow lot between a furniture repair shop and a vacant building that had once housed a printing business. The warehouse belonged officially to an import company that processed shipments arriving at New York's ports, but its actual function was to serve as a distribution point for heroin that entered Harlem through various smuggling channels. On the morning of April 7th, 1951, at approximately 9:30, the warehouse's interior was dimly lit by overhead bulbs that hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across stacks of wooden crates and cardboard boxes that contained both legitimate merchandise and concealed narcotics. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived at the warehouse that morning to inspect a shipment that was supposed to have arrived 2 days earlier from a supplier network operating through ports in Baltimore. Johnson was 45 years old, dressed in a dark gray suit with a white shirt and tie, despite the warehouse's informal setting. Johnson had been operating drug distribution networks in Harlem for several years by 1951, managing the complex logistics of receiving shipments from various sources, distributing narcotics to street-level dealers, and collecting payments that flowed back up through the organization. The work required constant attention to detail and careful verification that shipments matched what had been ordered and paid for. Johnson was accompanied by two of his senior associates who helped manage the distribution operations. Also present at the warehouse was Vincent Calabrese, a 42-year-old man who worked as a smuggler and courier transporting narcotics from ports where they arrived on ships to distribution points in New York. Calabrese had worked with Johnson's organization for approximately 8 months, handling perhaps a dozen shipments during that period. Calabrese was not part of Johnson's core inner circle, but rather operated as an independent contractor who was paid per delivery to transport materials and who maintained his own contacts with shipping networks. The purpose of the morning meeting was for Calabrese to account for the shipment he had been assigned to pick up in Baltimore 3 days earlier and to deliver to the Harlem warehouse. And the shipment was supposed to contain 5 kilograms of heroin that Johnson's organization had arranged to purchase from a supplier network. Johnson had paid $30,000 for the shipment, $6,000 per kilogram, with payment delivered through intermediaries before the narcotics were shipped. The arrangement was typical of how such transactions occurred. Payment first, delivery second, with trust and reputation serving as the primary enforcement mechanisms, since formal legal contracts obviously could not exist for illegal commodities. Calabrese explained that he had traveled to Baltimore as instructed, had made contact with the shipping network there, and had taken possession of the package. Calabrese stated that he had transported the package to New York and had stored it temporarily at a location he maintained in the Bronx before bringing it to the warehouse. Calabrese presented Johnson with a wrapped package that appeared to contain the expected shipment. The package was approximately the size and weight that 5 kilograms of heroin would produce when packaged for transport. Johnson asked Calabrese to confirm that the package contained the full 5 kilograms that had been ordered. Calabrese stated that it did, explaining that he had verified the contents when he received the package in Baltimore and that nothing had been removed or altered during transport. Calabrese emphasized that he understood the importance of accurate delivery and that he took his responsibilities seriously. Johnson's associate opened the package carefully while Johnson observed. Inside were several smaller packets wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape. The associate selected one of the packets at random and opened it, revealing white powder that appeared to be heroin. The associate examined the powder briefly, checking its texture and appearance against what experienced handlers knew heroin should look like. Everything appeared normal at this superficial level of inspection. However, Johnson's associate then produced a small scale, a tool that Johnson's organization routinely used to verify weights of narcotics shipments. The associate began weighing the individual packets systematically. As the weighing proceeded, a discrepancy became apparent. The total weight of the heroin in the package was approximately 4 kilograms rather than the 5 kilograms that Calabrese had stated was present and that Johnson had paid for. Johnson observed this weighing process without visible reaction. When the final measurement confirmed that the shipment was 1 kilogram short, Johnson turned to Calabrese and stated calmly that the package appeared to contain only 4 kilograms rather than 5. Johnson asked Calabrese to explain this discrepancy. Calabrese's expression shifted from confidence to concern. Calabrese stated that there must be some error with the scale or with the weighing process. Calabrese insisted that he had received 5 kilograms in Baltimore and that he had delivered exactly what he had received. Calabrese suggested that perhaps the supplier had shorted the shipment and that Calabrese should not be held responsible for problems that originated before he took possession of the materials. Johnson's associate weighed the packets again using the same scale, producing the same result, approximately 4 kilograms total. The associate then produced a second scale from storage and repeated the weighing process with this different instrument. The second scale confirmed the same measurement, 4 kilograms rather than 5. The probability that both scales were incorrect in exactly the same way was essentially 0, meaning the discrepancy was real rather than being a measurement error. Johnson asked Calabrese again to explain where the missing kilogram had gone. Calabrese maintained that he had delivered what he had received, and that if there was a shortage, it must have originated with the supplier. Calabrese stated that he had transported the package carefully and that nothing had been removed during the journey from Baltimore to New York. Calabrese's tone became defensive, suggesting that he resented the implication that he might have stolen from the shipment. Johnson listened to these explanations without showing anger or accusation. Johnson simply stated that the facts were clear. The organization had paid for 5 kilograms. Calabrese had stated the package contained 5 kilograms, but actual measurement showed only 4 kilograms present. Johnson said that this discrepancy needed to be understood and resolved. Johnson thanked Calabrese for delivering what he had delivered and stated that the matter would be investigated further. Calabrese left the warehouse appearing both relieved that no immediate confrontation had occurred and concerned about what investigation might reveal. After Calabrese departed, Johnson spoke briefly with his associates about the situation. One associate suggested that Calabrese had likely stolen the missing kilogram during transport, planning to sell it independently for his own profit. This type of theft was a constant risk in smuggling operations. Couriers had access to valuable commodities and opportunity to divert portions for personal gain. The associate recommended that Calabrese should be confronted more aggressively and that appropriate enforcement action should be taken to recover the stolen narcotics or to punish the theft. Johnson replied that while Calabrese might indeed have stolen the missing kilogram, it was also possible that the shortage had originated with the Baltimore supplier or that some other explanation existed. Johnson stated that he wanted to understand exactly what had happened before deciding on any response. Johnson emphasized that the organization's reputation depended on being perceived as fair and accurate in its dealings, and that punishing someone without clear evidence would undermine that reputation just as much as tolerating theft would. Johnson left the warehouse and walked north on 8th Avenue toward his apartment. As he walked, and his outward demeanor remained calm and controlled, giving no indication of the significance of what had just occurred. But Johnson's mind was working systematically through the implications of Calabrese's lie and what strategic response the situation required. The immediate problem was straightforward. The organization had paid for 5 kilograms of heroin, but had received only 4 kilograms, creating a loss of approximately $6,000 plus the foregone profit from selling the missing kilogram. If Calabrese had stolen the missing narcotics, that theft needed to be addressed to prevent similar losses in the future and to deter other associates from attempting comparable diversions. But Johnson recognized that the deeper problem was not the specific loss from this particular shipment, but rather the structural vulnerability that the incident revealed. Johnson's drug distribution operations depended on a network of couriers, smugglers, and intermediaries who handled narcotics at various stages from import to street-level distribution. Each of these intermediaries had opportunity to steal portions of shipments, to substitute inferior product for high-quality narcotics, or to otherwise divert value for personal gain. The organization attempted to prevent such theft through reputation and through threat of punishment, but ultimately these preventive measures relied on the organization's ability to detect theft when it occurred. The weighing scales that Johnson's associate had used represented one level of verification. But Calabrese's willingness to lie about the shipment's contents demonstrated that couriers understood they could attempt to deceive as long as they thought the deception would not be detected. If Calabrese had successfully lied about this shipment, if Johnson's associate had not weighed the contents, or if the weighing had been done less carefully, Calabrese would have pocketed $6,000 worth of heroin without consequence. The fact that Calabrese had attempted the lie suggested that Calabrese believed he might succeed. Johnson understood that responding to Calabrese's specific lie was less important than addressing the broader system that made such lies possible and potentially profitable. As the organization needed verification mechanisms that were comprehensive enough that couriers understood they could not successfully lie about shipment contents, and needed a demonstrated track record of detecting lies, so that couriers understood that attempting deception was futile, regardless of how clever they thought their specific scheme might be. Over the following days, Johnson developed a multi-layered strategy for addressing both Calabrese's immediate lie and the systemic vulnerability it represented. The first component of the strategy was investigating exactly what had happened to the missing kilogram. Johnson needed to determine whether Calabrese had stolen it, whether the Baltimore supplier had shorted the shipment, or whether some other explanation accounted for the discrepancy. This investigation would require reaching back through the supply chain to understand what each party had actually done versus what they claimed to have done. Johnson enlisted several key figures to help execute this investigation. The first was Marcus Hendricks, a man who maintained relationships with various port workers and shipping personnel in Baltimore, and who could investigate what had actually been loaded onto transport when Calabrese picked up the package. Hendricks was 58 years old, someone who had worked in and around ports for 4 decades, and who understood how shipping operations functioned. Hendricks could speak with dock workers, shipping clerks, and warehouse personnel who might have information about what Calabrese had received. The second key ally was Thomas Chen, an accountant who maintained detailed financial records for Johnson's operations and who could trace the flow of payments and shipments through the organization's books. Chen could document what had been paid, what had been received, and what discrepancies existed between expectations and reality. Chen's records would provide the foundation for demonstrating that theft or shortage had occurred rather than simply representing accounting confusion. The third critical figure was Reverend James Caldwell, a minister who maintained relationships with various community members and who could gather information through conversations that appeared casual rather than investigative. Caldwell could speak with people who might have seen Calabrese during his transport from Baltimore to New York, with individuals who knew Calabrese's associates, and with sources who might have heard Calabrese discussing plans to divert narcotics. Caldwell's involvement would provide information that more direct investigation might not uncover. Over the following 10 days, this investigation proceeded through multiple channels. Hendricks traveled to Baltimore and spoke with port workers who had been involved in preparing the package that Calabrese picked up. These workers confirmed that the package had contained 5 kilograms when it was prepared for transfer to Calabrese. One worker specifically remembered weighing the contents because the supplier had been concerned about ensuring accurate weight. This testimony established that the shortage had not originated with the Baltimore supplier, but rather had occurred after Calabrese took possession. Chen reviewed the financial records and confirmed that Johnson's organization had paid for 5 kilograms, and that no adjustments had been made to account for any known shortage. Chen's documentation showed clearly that there was a discrepancy between what had been paid for and what had been received, and that this discrepancy represented real financial loss rather than accounting error. Caldwell's more subtle investigation produced the most valuable information. Through conversations with people who knew Calabrese, Caldwell learned that Calabrese had been discussing plans to purchase a small business, a legitimate enterprise that would provide Calabrese with legal income and perhaps serve as a front for laundering proceeds from smuggling work. And the purchase required capital that Calabrese had not appeared to possess based on his legitimate earnings. Additionally, one of Caldwell's sources reported seeing Calabrese meeting with an independent drug dealer who operated outside Johnson's network, suggesting that Calabrese might be selling narcotics independently. This accumulated evidence pointed clearly to the conclusion that Calabrese had diverted the missing kilogram during transport and had either already sold it or was planning to sell it outside Johnson's distribution network. Calabrese had lied when he stated that he had delivered the full 5 kilograms and had maintained that lie even when confronted with weighing that showed the shortage. The lie had been deliberate rather than mistaken, and had been designed to allow Calabrese to profit from theft while avoiding accountability. With this evidence assembled, Johnson moved to the second phase of his strategy, Confronting Calabrese with proof of the lie in ways that would not only address this specific incident, but would also demonstrate to everyone in the organization that lies could not succeed because Johnson possessed the capability to verify claims independently and comprehensively. Johnson arranged a meeting with Calabrese on April 20th, 13 days after the initial delivery. The meeting occurred at a different location, a social club on 135th Street that Johnson controlled and where Johnson could ensure privacy and control over the setting. Johnson arrived accompanied by the same two associates who had been present at the warehouse. Calabrese arrived alone, apparently expecting a routine discussion about future work assignments. Johnson began by stating that the investigation into the missing kilogram had been completed and that the findings were clear. Johnson explained that port workers in Baltimore had confirmed the package contained 5 kilograms when Calabrese received it, that financial records confirmed payment had been made for 5 kilograms, that witnesses had seen Calabrese meeting with independent dealers, and that Calabrese had recently acquired capital for business purchases that exceeded his legitimate earnings. Johnson stated that all of this evidence pointed to one conclusion. Calabrese had stolen the missing kilogram and had lied when claiming he had delivered the full shipment. Calabrese's expression shifted from casual confidence to evident concern as Johnson presented this evidence. Calabrese started to offer explanations and denials, but Johnson interrupted calmly to state that the time for explanations had passed. Johnson explained that he understood Calabrese had made a choice to steal from the organization and to lie about that theft, and the choices had consequences. However, Johnson did not threaten violence or immediate punishment. Instead, Johnson explained that Calabrese now faced a decision about his future. Calabrese could continue denying the theft and lying about what had happened, in which case Johnson would conclude that Calabrese was fundamentally untrustworthy and would sever all relationship with Calabrese permanently, while also ensuring that Calabrese's reputation for dishonesty became known throughout Harlem's criminal networks. This outcome would make it difficult for Calabrese to work with any reputable organization going forward. Alternatively, Calabrese could acknowledge what he had done, could return the stolen narcotics or pay their value, and could commit to complete honesty in all future dealings. If Calabrese chose this path, Johnson would allow Calabrese to continue working with the organization, but under a new arrangement where every claim Calabrese made would be verified independently and where Calabrese's compensation would be reduced to account for the additional verification costs his dishonesty had created. Johnson gave Calabrese 24 hours to decide which path he would choose. Johnson emphasized that the decision was Calabrese's to make, and that Johnson would respect whichever choice Calabrese made while enforcing the consequences that came with that choice. Calabrese left the meeting understanding that his lie had been completely exposed and that his options now were to acknowledge the truth or to face permanent exclusion from Johnson's organization and damage to his reputation throughout Harlem. Over the following day, Calabrese consulted with associates and weighed his options. The strategic calculation was difficult because acknowledging the theft meant admitting wrongdoing and accepting reduced status, but maintaining the denial meant losing access to Johnson's network and potentially facing broader consequences. On April 21st, Calabrese contacted Johnson and stated that he was prepared to acknowledge what he had done. Calabrese admitted that he had diverted 1 kilogram from the shipment and had sold it to an independent dealer for personal profit. Calabrese stated that he had used the proceeds to make a down payment on the business he was purchasing. Calabrese offered to repay the value of the stolen narcotics over time from his future earnings and committed to complete honesty in all future dealings with Johnson's organization. Johnson accepted this acknowledgment and structured a new arrangement with Calabrese. Calabrese would continue working as a courier, but would be paid 20% less than previously to account for the increased verification that would accompany Calabrese's work. Every shipment Calabrese handled would be weighed and inspected independently before and after transport, creating a paper trail that would detect any future theft immediately. Calabrese would repay the $6,000 value of the stolen narcotics over 18 months through deductions from his courier fees. Most significantly, Johnson made clear that this was Calabrese's one opportunity for redemption. Any future dishonesty, no matter how minor, would result in permanent exclusion. This resolution produced several immediate effects. Calabrese's acknowledgment of the theft and his acceptance of the new terms became known throughout Johnson's organization. The story of how Johnson had investigated the missing kilogram, had assembled comprehensive evidence, and had confronted Calabrese with proof became part of the organizational lore. The lesson was clear. Lying to Johnson was futile because Johnson possessed both the capability and the commitment to verify claims independently. For Calabrese specifically, the experience transformed his relationship with Johnson's organization. Having lied once and having that lie exposed completely, Calabrese understood that future attempts at deception would be detected even more certainly. Over the following years, Calabrese continued working as a courier under the verified arrangement Johnson had established. Calabrese became known for scrupulous honesty in reporting shipment contents, in documenting any problems that occurred during transport, and in providing accurate information about all aspects of his work. The transformation was not primarily because Calabrese had become more moral, but rather because Calabrese understood that dishonesty was now impossible. The verification systems Johnson had implemented would detect any lie, and the consequences of being caught lying again would be severe. More significantly, Johnson used Calabrese's case as the foundation for implementing systematic verification throughout the organization's operations. Johnson expanded the practice of weighing and inspecting all shipments before and after transport, creating documentation that tracked every movement of narcotics through the distribution network. Johnson established multiple independent verification channels so that couriers understood they were being monitored by several different parties who could cross-check information. Johnson invested in better equipment for testing narcotics purity, ensuring that substitution of inferior product could be detected. These systemic changes required additional resources, more personnel for verification, more equipment for testing, more time for documentation. But Johnson understood that these costs were investments in organizational reliability that would pay dividends by preventing theft and by creating a culture where honesty was the only viable option. The verification systems meant that anyone handling narcotics knew they could not successfully steal or lie about what they were doing. which reduced both theft and the time wasted investigating suspicious incidents. The impact of these changes extended beyond theft prevention to affect the organization's overall operational efficiency. When everyone in the network understood that verification was comprehensive and that lies would be detected, communication became more accurate. Couriers reported problems honestly rather than trying to conceal mistakes or complications. Suppliers provided accurate information about shipment contents rather than attempting to inflate claims. Dealers at various levels of the distribution network maintained honest records of what they received and what they sold. This culture of enforced honesty created reliability that distinguished Johnson's organization from competitors who operated with less systematic verification. Suppliers preferred working with Johnson's network because they knew payments would be accurate and disputes would be resolved based on documented evidence rather than on whoever could make the most aggressive claims. Dealers preferred working with Johnson's network because they knew the product quality and quantity would match what had been promised. The verification systems created trust, not trust in individual good intentions, but trust in systematic accountability that made dishonesty impractical. For Harlem's broader drug economy, Johnson's verification systems established standards that influenced how other organizations operated. Word spread through criminal networks that Johnson's operation maintained detailed records and comprehensive verification that made theft impossible. This reputation had multiple effects. Or it deterred people who might have considered stealing from Johnson's organization because they understood they would be caught. It attracted reliable workers who valued working in an environment where honest effort was rewarded and where they would not be falsely accused of theft that they did not commit. It created competitive pressure on other organizations to implement similar verification or to accept that they would lose the most reliable associates to Johnson's better-managed network. The specific episode of Calabrese's lie and its exposure became a reference point that Johnson and his associates referenced when training new workers or when explaining organizational standards. New couriers were told the story of how Calabrese had attempted to lie about a shipment, how Johnson had investigated comprehensively, how the lie had been exposed with detailed evidence, and how Calabrese had been required to acknowledge the truth and accept modified terms. The story communicated essential lessons. Lies would be detected through verification, acknowledgement of truth, created opportunity for continued work, while maintaining lies led to exclusion, and the organization valued honesty not for moral reasons, but because honesty was required for efficient operations. Calabrese himself became a somewhat paradoxical figure within the organization, someone known for having lied once, but also known for complete honesty thereafter. Calabrese's transformation from someone willing to deceive to someone scrupulously honest served as living proof of how Johnson's verification systems and enforcement mechanisms functioned. When Calabrese reported information about shipments, people believed it because they knew Calabrese understood the consequences of lying and had personally experienced how Johnson would respond to deception. The verification documentation that Johnson's organization accumulated over years of operations created another form of power beyond the immediate prevention of theft. The detailed records of shipments, weights, purities, payments, and distributions provided Johnson with comprehensive understanding of how the drug trade functioned in New York. Johnson could identify patterns in supply availability, could track which suppliers were reliable versus which ones tried to cheat, could understand which dealers sold most efficiently and which ones struggled with distribution. This information allowed Johnson to optimize operations in ways that competitors who operated with less systematic record-keeping could not match. When Johnson was arrested in 1952 and subsequently convicted on federal drug conspiracy charges, the detailed record-keeping that had made his organization so efficient also provided prosecutors with evidence of the scope of his operations. The verification documents that had prevented internal theft became proof of criminal activity when examined by law enforcement. This ironic outcome illustrated how the same systematic approach that made Johnson's operations effective also created vulnerability when those operations attracted legal scrutiny. During Johnson's imprisonment from 1952 through 1963, the verification systems he had established continued to function, allowing his organization to maintain operations even in his absence. The associates who managed the network during Johnson's incarceration followed the procedures Johnson had implemented, maintaining the documentation and verification that kept theft minimal and communication accurate. When Johnson returned to Harlem after his release in 1963, he found that the organizational culture of verified honesty had persisted and that the systems he had built remained effective. In the final 5 years of Johnson's life, from 1963 to 1968, he continued to emphasize verification and documentation in all aspects of his operations. The experience with Calabrese's lie 2 decades earlier remained relevant as a teaching example about how deception must be met with systematic verification rather than with simple punishment. Johnson's reputation for being impossible to lie to successfully became part of his broader reputation for sophisticated organizational management that distinguished him from less capable criminal operators. When Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, his legacy included not just the territory he had controlled or the money he had made, but also the organizational systems he had created for ensuring accountability in environments where formal legal contracts could not exist. The verification mechanisms, the culture of enforced honesty, the understanding that lies would be detected through comprehensive investigation, these became part of how people who had worked with Johnson understood how effective criminal organizations could function. The story of Calabrese lying once and then telling the truth forever after became part of Harlem's oral tradition about Johnson's methods. The story was sometimes told with embellishment that exaggerated the consequences Calabrese had faced, or that simplified the investigation Johnson had conducted. But the essential narrative remained consistent. Someone had tried to deceive Johnson. Johnson had responded not with immediate violence, but with systematic investigation. The lie had been exposed through comprehensive evidence. The liar had been forced to acknowledge the truth and had never lied again because the experience had demonstrated that lying was futile. The broader significance of this episode related to how it illustrated principles about creating accountability in relationships where trust cannot be assumed and where formal enforcement mechanisms do not exist. Johnson's response to Calabrese's lie demonstrated that accountability required 3 elements: the capability to verify claims independently, the commitment to actually conduct verification rather than simply trusting statements, and the enforcement of consequences that made dishonesty more costly than honesty. The verification capability came from Johnson's investment in scales, in personnel who could investigate shipments, in relationships that provided information from multiple sources. Many criminal operators lacked this verification capability and therefore had to rely on trust or on punishment after the fact when theft was suspected. Johnson's systematic approach meant he could detect lies at the time they occurred, rather than discovering theft only later, when damage had already accumulated. The commitment to verification was equally important because capability alone did not ensure accountability. Johnson could have owned scales but not used them, could have maintained relationships in Baltimore but not asked them to investigate. Johnson's consistent verification of shipments meant that associates understood they would be checked rather than simply trusted. This understanding deterred attempted deception because potential liars knew they would likely be caught. The enforcement of consequences completed the accountability system by ensuring that detection of lies led to meaningful outcomes. Calabrese had been required to acknowledge his theft, to repay its value, to accept reduced compensation, and to work under enhanced verification. These consequences were proportional rather than maximal. Johnson had not killed Calabrese or even completely excluded him from the organization, but they were sufficient to transform Calabrese's behavior because Calabrese understood that the costs of lying exceeded any benefits it might produce. This combination of verification capability, commitment to verification, and proportional enforcement created a system where honesty emerged as the rational choice, even among people who had no moral objection to lying. Calabrese told the truth after his initial lie, not because he had become more ethical, but because he had learned that lying was impractical given Johnson's verification systems. The transformation from liar to truth-teller occurred through strategic calculation rather than through moral conversion. The episode also illustrated how reputational effects amplify direct consequences. Calabrese's lie and its exposure became known throughout Johnson's organization and throughout Harlem's criminal networks. This public knowledge meant that Calabrese acquired a reputation as someone who had been caught lying, which affected how others dealt with him. Even though Calabrese subsequently became scrupulously honest, people remembered that he had once been caught lying and therefore scrutinized his claims more carefully. And this reputational consequence reinforced the direct consequences Johnson had imposed and made future dishonesty even less attractive. For Johnson's organizational culture more broadly, the episode established that verification was not an occasional practice, but rather was a systematic feature of how operations functioned. Every courier, every dealer, every associate understood that claims would be checked and that lying would be detected. This understanding transformed communication throughout the network because people knew that honesty was required and that attempted deception would fail. The systematic nature of Johnson's verification also prevented the gradual erosion of honesty that could occur in organizations that relied on periodic examples rather than on consistent enforcement. If Johnson had verified shipments only occasionally or had investigated lies only when they seemed particularly egregious, associates would have understood that some lies might succeed if timed carefully or if made plausible enough. But Johnson's comprehensive verification meant that all lies were likely to be detected regardless of how carefully they were constructed, which eliminated the possibility that skillful liars could succeed where clumsy ones failed. The story of how a smuggler lied to Bumpy Johnson once and then told the truth forever after became a parable about accountability in environments where formal institutions cannot be relied upon. The lesson extended beyond criminal organizations to any context where verification must substitute for trust, where documentation must replace formal contracts, and where systematic processes must create reliability that individual good intentions cannot guarantee. In the decades after Johnson's death, as scholars and journalists examined Harlem's criminal history, the emphasis on verification and documentation in Johnson's operations stood out as evidence of sophisticated organizational management. Criminal enterprises are often imagined as chaotic and governed primarily by violence, but Johnson's approach demonstrated that effective criminal organizations required the same kinds of systematic processes that legitimate businesses needed: accurate record-keeping, verification of claims, accountability for mistakes, and enforcement of standards. The verification systems Johnson implemented in response to Calabrese's lie represented a form of bureaucratic rationalization applied to illegal operations. The scales that weighed shipments, the personnel who inspected contents, the documentation that tracked movements, the independent sources who could corroborate claims, all of these created an organizational infrastructure that made the drug trade operate more efficiently and more predictably. This infrastructure was Johnson's response to the fundamental problem that illegal operations face: how to ensure compliance and honesty when legal enforcement is unavailable. The transformation that Calabrese experienced, from someone willing to lie for profit to someone scrupulously honest in all professional dealings, illustrated how individual behavior responds to institutional constraints. Given an environment where lying might succeed, Calabrese had attempted to lie. Confronted with verification systems that made lying futile, Calabrese became honest. The change was not in Calabrese's character, but in the strategic environment that shaped his choices. Johnson's accomplishment was creating that strategic environment through systematic verification. The quiet ending to Calabrese's story reflected the mature sophistication of Johnson's approach. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, no violence or threats beyond the implicit understanding that exclusion from Johnson's organization would harm Calabrese's livelihood. Calabrese acknowledged his lie when presented with overwhelming evidence, accepted the modified terms that Johnson offered, and spent the remainder of his association with Johnson's organization demonstrating scrupulous honesty. The transformation was complete and lasting because it was based on clear understanding of consequences rather than on fear of unpredictable retaliation. For the Harlem community and for organized crime in New York more broadly, the precedent that Johnson established through his response to Calabrese's lie influenced how other criminal operators thought about verification and accountability. Johnson's reputation for maintaining detailed records and for detecting lies became part of his broader reputation for organizational competence. People who worked with Johnson understood they were joining an operation that functioned systematically rather than chaotically. And when this understanding attracted capable individuals who valued predictability and fairness even in illegal contexts. The systems Johnson created outlasted his personal involvement because they were institutional rather than individual. The procedures for weighing shipments, the practices of independent verification, the culture of documentation, these continued operating even when Johnson was imprisoned and eventually after his death because they had become embedded in how the organization functioned. The specific incident of Calabrese's lie became historical, but the systems that incident had helped establish remained relevant as long as Johnson's organization continued operations. In the final accounting, the story of how a smuggler lied once and then told the truth forever after was the story of how Johnson built accountability through verification, how he transformed individual behavior through institutional design, and how he created organizational reliability in an environment where such reliability could not be assumed. The power Johnson demonstrated was not the power to punish lies after the fact, but rather the power to make lies impossible through comprehensive verification that detected deception before it could cause lasting damage. That power came from patient investment in systems, from commitment to checking claims rather than trusting them, and from proportional enforcement that made honesty the only rational choice, even for people with no moral commitment to truth.